Behind the voice that has moved millions to tears stands a man whose entire existence has been defined by extraordinary loss. Andrea Bocelli, the Italian tenor whose name became synonymous with triumph over impossible odds, now faces a chapter that has left even his most devoted admirers heartbroken and struggling to comprehend the weight of what has unfolded. The world knows him as the blind singer who conquered every stage, every boundary, every limitation placed before him. But what recent events have revealed goes far deeper than the public ever imagined, touching the very foundation of everything he built and everyone he loved. For decades, Bocelli's story served as a beacon of hope. The boy who should never have been born, who lost his sight at 12, who turned darkness into the most luminous musical career of his generation. Yet beneath the standing ovations and the record-breaking albums, beneath the collaborations with legends and the performances for popes and presidents, a different narrative was quietly taking shape. One marked not by the triumphs the world celebrated, but by the silent sacrifices and devastating losses that no spotlight could ever illuminate. What makes this moment so profoundly tragic is the timing. Just as Andrea Bocelli reached what many considered the pinnacle of his legacy, just as he stood ready to pass the torch to the next generation, life delivered a blow so crushing that it forced the maestro to confront the most painful question any artist can face. After giving everything to his craft, after surviving every tragedy and emerging stronger, what happens when the very foundation of your existence is suddenly stripped away? When the people who made you who you are, who believed in you when no one else would, are no longer there to witness the fruits of their faith? The news that emerged sent shockwaves through the classical music world and beyond. Not because it was unexpected in the cruel mathematics of time and mortality, but because of what it represented. The severing of the final thread connecting Andrea Bocelli to the origins of his miracle. The loss of the one person whose single decision, made in the face of overwhelming medical pressure 66 years ago, gave the world the gift of his voice. To understand the magnitude of this heartbreak, we must return to where it all began, to the choice that defied logic and forever altered the course of music history. In 1958, in the rolling hills of Tuscany, a young woman named Eddie Bocelli faced a decision that would echo through generations. Pregnant and hopeful, she had gone for what should have been a routine medical consultation. Instead, she emerged from that sterile hospital room carrying the weight of an impossible choice. The doctors had been clear, their voices clinical and certain. The child she carried would be born with severe visual impairment. The recommendation was swift and decisive: terminate the pregnancy to spare the family years of struggle and the child a lifetime of hardship. But Eddie Bocelli possessed something that medical textbooks could never quantify. Call it intuition, call it faith, call it a mother's unshakable belief that every life carries purpose beyond what science can measure. She looked at those doctors, men who had spent years studying the mechanics of life and death, and made a choice that defied their expertise. She would carry her son to term, regardless of what challenges awaited them both. On September 22, 1958, Andrea Bocelli entered a world he would never fully see with his eyes but would experience with an intensity that few sighted people could ever comprehend. The doctors had been correct about his condition. Congenital glaucoma clouded his vision from birth, reducing the vibrant world around him to shadows and impressions of light. What they could not have predicted was how this seeming limitation would become the catalyst for something extraordinary. Eddie became more than a mother to Andrea. She became his interpreter of beauty, describing sunsets he could not see and painting word pictures of the Tuscan landscape that surrounded their home. When other children ran and played games that relied on sight, she sat with her son at an old piano, guiding his small fingers across the keys. She did not see his blindness as something to overcome but rather as a different way of experiencing the richness of existence. The relationship between mother and son deepened with each passing year. While his father worked the land and his siblings navigated the world with ease, Andrea and Eddie existed in their own universe of sound and sensation. She was there through the 13 painful surgeries that attempted to restore his vision, holding his hand through procedures that ultimately failed but somehow strengthened their bond. She was there when, at age 12, a soccer ball destroyed his remaining sight completely, plunging him into total darkness. Through every setback, every moment when the world seemed determined to remind Andrea of his limitations, Eddie Bocelli remained his constant. She never spoke of his blindness as a tragedy, never allowed him to see himself as anything less than capable of achieving whatever he set his mind to accomplish. What Eddie Bocelli could never have imagined was that her unwavering belief in her son would eventually reach every corner of the globe. As Andrea grew from a tentative child into a determined young man, her influence shaped not just his character but his understanding of what music could mean to the human soul. She was there when he made the painful decision to study law, honoring his family's practical concerns while secretly nurturing his musical dreams in dimly lit piano bars across Tuscany. The night that changed everything came in the early 1990s, when fate orchestrated a meeting between Andrea and the legendary Luciano Pavarotti. When Pavarotti heard the demo recording that would launch Andrea's career, declaring that no one could sing better than this unknown tenor from a small Italian town, Eddie Bocelli wept. Not tears of surprise, but tears of vindication. She had always known her son possessed something extraordinary. Now the world would know it too. Through Andrea's meteoric rise, through the record-breaking albums and sold-out concerts, and through collaborations with Sarah Brightman and Celine Dion that captivated audiences worldwide, Eddie remained his anchor. She attended his performances whenever possible, sitting in the front row not to see her son but to let him hear her presence. Andrea would later say that knowing his mother was in the audience changed everything about how he sang, infusing each note with the love and faith that had sustained him since childhood. When Andrea married and welcomed children of his own, Eddie embraced her role as grandmother with the same fierce devotion she had shown as a mother. She watched as her son's voice carried him to stages she had only dreamed of, to performances before popes and presidents, to moments of recognition that seemed to validate every difficult decision she had made decades earlier. The woman who had refused to let doctors define her son's limitations lived to see him transcend every boundary they had predicted. But as the years passed, as Andrea's fame grew to unprecedented heights, both mother and son understood an unspoken truth. Time, that most impartial judge, was advancing steadily. The hands that had first guided him to the piano were becoming more fragile. The voice that had first described the world's beauty to him grew softer. The presence that had been his constant source of strength for more than 6 decades was beginning to show the inevitable signs of mortality. Neither spoke of what they both knew was coming. Instead, they treasured each conversation, each shared meal, each moment when Andrea would call simply to hear her voice. What they could not have anticipated was how cruel the final chapter of their story would become or how much the world would share in their profound loss. The year 2022 began like so many others for Andrea Bocelli. At 64, he had reached a stage in his career where each performance felt like a gift, each recording a testament to the extraordinary journey that had brought him from a small Tuscan town to the world's most prestigious stages. His voice, though touched by the passage of time, still carried the emotional weight that had made him a global phenomenon. His family was thriving, his children following in his musical footsteps, his legacy secure. But even as Andrea prepared for what would become one of the most significant years of his career, with performances and recordings that would celebrate his enduring impact on classical and popular music, shadows were gathering in the most personal corners of his life. Eddie Bocelli, now well into her 80s, had begun showing signs that the inexorable march of time was finally claiming its due. The woman who had defied medical experts to give her son life, who had spent decades being his eyes and his inspiration, was quietly facing her own battle against mortality. For Andrea, watching his mother's gradual decline was perhaps more difficult than any challenge his career had ever presented. This was the person whose voice had shaped his understanding of beauty, whose unwavering faith had carried him through every dark moment of his childhood and beyond. As months passed, the reality that both mother and son had long avoided confronting became impossible to ignore. The conversations that had once lasted hours grew shorter. The enthusiasm that had always marked Eddie's discussions of Andrea's career became more subdued. The woman who had given everything to ensure her son could share his gift with the world was preparing for her final journey. What made this period especially heartbreaking was Andrea's helplessness. The man whose voice had comforted millions in their darkest hours found himself unable to sing away his mother's pain. The son who had conquered stages across 5 continents discovered that there was no performance, no recording, and no amount of international acclaim that could halt the one opponent he had never learned to defeat, time itself. When the end came, it arrived with the quiet dignity that had always characterized Eddie Bocelli's approach to life's greatest challenges. Surrounded by family, having lived to see her son achieve heights that no one in 1958 could have imagined possible, she passed away peacefully. But for Andrea Bocelli, her death represented more than the loss of a beloved mother. With Eddie's passing, Andrea Bocelli lost far more than a mother. He lost the living embodiment of the miracle that had made his entire existence possible. The woman whose single act of defiance against medical certainty had given the world his voice was gone, taking with her the final connection to the origins of his extraordinary story. For the first time in his life, the man who had sung for millions found himself truly alone with the weight of his legacy. The grief that followed was unlike anything Andrea had experienced, even during the darkest moments of his childhood. This was not the temporary setback of a failed surgery or the challenge of learning to navigate a world without sight. This was the permanent severing of the bond that had sustained him for more than 60 years. The voice that had first encouraged him to touch piano keys, that had described sunsets he would never see, that had whispered reassurances during his most difficult performances, was silent forever. In the months that followed Eddie's death, those closest to Andrea noticed a profound change. The man who had always carried himself with quiet confidence seemed somehow smaller, more vulnerable. His performances, while still technically magnificent, carried a new depth of melancholy that audiences found both heartbreaking and deeply moving. He was singing not just with his voice but with the full weight of loss that now colored every note. What makes this tragedy particularly devastating is its timing. Just as Andrea had reached the point where he could truly appreciate the magnitude of his mother's sacrifice, just as he had achieved the wisdom to fully understand how her decision in 1958 had shaped not just his life but the lives of countless others who found comfort in his music, she was no longer there to share in that recognition. The world continues to celebrate Andrea Bocelli, to marvel at his voice and his triumph over adversity. But behind every performance now stands the shadow of profound loss. The man who learned to see beauty through darkness must now navigate a world without the guiding light that had illuminated his path from the very beginning. As we reflect on this chapter in Andrea Bocelli's remarkable journey, we are reminded that even our greatest triumphs are built upon foundations of love and sacrifice that we often take for granted until they are gone. Eddie Bocelli's legacy lives on in every note her son sings, but for Andrea, the music will forever carry the bittersweet knowledge that his greatest supporter, his first believer, is no longer there to hear it.